Our next speaker grew up in Kenya before studying sculpture at St Martin's College of Art, then turned to medicine and became a specialist registrar in adult psychiatry. Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Lauren Gavaghan, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks.
Jesus, you're all so funny. So, where am I? Yeah. So, Akram Khan, one of our most acclaimed choreographers in this country, thanks, said last week that dance is as important as maths and being a doctor. And I'm really glad he said this, and as a doctor who dances, I agree. So he's calling for the government to put dance on the British school curriculum, and meanwhile, I'm hoping that dance might be included as a routine part of psychiatric care. So I want to explain a little bit, or explore a little bit about how dance might transcend barriers within a mental health services, and speak a little bit about how that and meditation might transform inpatient acute psychiatric wards. So right now, there's a lot of people who are on psychiatric wards, and this year I've had friends who, for one reason or another, have ended up as inpatients. So I've been afforded this opportunity to see things from a very different perspective, sort of became an insider on the outside. And obviously there are many reasons for why people end up being admitted to psychiatric hospitals. I don't want to underestimate tonight the degree of distress that people experience through mental illness. And I think we could debate for hours about what mental illness is or isn't, but it's not why I'm here. And I'm hoping to just talk about how we might make some changes. So for any of you who have been in a psychiatric ward, you might know something of what these places are like. And if you haven't been on a ward, I guess I want you to imagine getting about 20 people together who are all having a really hard time in life. Some are depressed, even suicidal, some are manic, others are angry, others are anxious, and others might just be inhabiting worlds that they don't usually inhabit. And now imagine putting everyone together in a locked, often very characterless clinical environment with very little to do, away from their own homes, their own belongings, their support networks, their families, their friends, their dogs, their cats, nicotine, and blue skies. And now imagine if this was you being told that this is the place where you will get better. Is it any wonder then that psychiatric wards tend to be very chaotic places and sadly often the part of people's journeys which they find most traumatizing and distressing? And often this distress develops into aggression and can in turn be met by a kind of aggression. So the very place, therefore, where people want to be safe, a place where they want to be allowed to express their distress, actually, paradoxically, tends to sometimes obstruct or even punish this expression. So I want us to move towards more healing environments, and I want us to think about breakthrough rather than break down, as Lang says here, and kind of think about how, as staff, we can have a part to play in this. And I believe that in many respects, our systems themselves are sick, and unless we help the system, we can't really begin to make things better for the people who then enter them. So we all know, and people have mentioned this evening, funding cuts amongst many other things are really affecting mental health services at the moment, and they are definitely not given the priority that physical health is at the moment. So please write to your MPs. Irving Goffman wrote a lot on asylums in the 1960s. And he was very interested in this idea of the social life of institutions. So he talked about these very formalized routines on wards, which actually aren't so different to today, such that a patient will move through very much the same sequence of events day in, day out. So waking up, medication, washing, sitting around, maybe joining a group, eating medication, and so on. And people are given leave at various points in this journey. And he talked about the sort of focus being on the world of the patient, so rather than the staff, so that there was this sort of huge split between this much larger patient group and the group of staff, such that the patients would have this very restricted contact with the outside world, yet staff would maintain this social integration and go home after work and so on. And he talked about these groups conceiving of each other in this very hostile way. And I think this split, this demarcation that he talks about, is one that could be bridged and transcended through dance movement in some way. And he talked about this sort of curtailment of self, so brought about initially by this barrier that the patient has with the outside world, but also talked about what it meant for a person to lose their personal possessions on a ward, this sort of personal defacement, he called it. And I think this is really interesting in terms of identity being a very crucial issue today when people do lose their personal belongings on a ward. And I think that though his writings are old, I think they're really important, and I think that we can learn a lot about the potentially very destructive ways our systems can work. Another example of this, of course, taken to a very extreme level, was Zimbardo's famous Stanford prison experiment, which showed obviously in a very terrifying way what humans will do in terms of assuming power roles and how readily people actually conform to behaviors that are expected of them. And here it was this sort of situational explanation of behavior rather than dispositional one. So it was the environment that actually that was constructed that led to people assuming the roles that they did. And again, I'm not suggesting that our wards are like Zimbardo's prison experiment, but I do think that we can learn lessons from this. And I think the Mid-Staffs inquiry and the Francis report, which was fairly recent, showed a lot of what can go wrong when people lose their sense of identity and compassion, and how easily this can happen even to the most well-intentioned of human beings. So it does have implications for psychiatric wards today, and indeed any ward. And I'm just wondering how much the environment, the situation can really impact and change people's behaviors, such that they're no longer their authentic selves, but instead actually assuming these roles that they believe are expected of them. And what happens in this sort of process of de-individualization of a patient and staff also, and what behaviors might result from this. And I think often on mental health wards, you do see stuff going on, behaviors that are not necessarily as a result of the mental illness per se, but instead because of this very, very restricted environment that people find themselves in. And there was this moment once, which I always remember, which was kind of beautiful and really saddening. I remember being on call one night and walking onto a ward and seeing through the glass of the living room that this female nurse was dancing with a patient. And it was this amazing, joy. And as I walked into the room, they just stopped. The nurse sort of ruffled up her clothing as if she'd had sex for the first time and been found or something. And this really resonated with me, and I kind of thought, why is that? Why do these hierarchies exist such something so nice can sort of stop like that? And of course, there's many reasons for that. And I think that some of these questions drew me to train in something called open dialogue, which is an approach used in Finland for the treatment of mental illness, where a lot of attention is paid to sort of breaking down these barriers and these hierarchies. And actually what they've found is that what happens when that is allowed is that people sort of develop or are enabled to access their own psychological resources, such that actually they recover much more easily. So, it's this idea that it's rather than doing to, it's being with, and not us kind of going to cure all your ills, but actually you have agency and you're empowered to make these changes yourself. And Jaakko Sukula, the professor of psychology who pioneered open dialogue, talked about embodiment. He's very interested in this idea of the body. So he says, all our experiences leave a sign in our body, but only a minimal part of these ever become formulated into spoken narratives. And Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French phenomenologist, also talked about how meaning is grounded in our bodily engagement with our environment. And in fact, this can be seen right from when we're babies. Obviously, you watch a baby, there's no language yet, but actually they're making meaning all the time from their environment. And John Dewey, who was a philosopher of the embodied mind, talked about this body-mind, that there actually was no distinction between mind and body. And yet here we are working in totally disembodied environments and systems in the NHS or in psychiatry, in my experience, relying on language all the time for communication, even in the midst of acute distress, when actually there's no real words that can be sufficient often. So just to tie this all together a little, I don't know where I am on this, but anyway, I want to think about how we can create more embodied environments in mental health services. And I think that this will hopefully in turn result in more authentic interactions between staff and patients, where there's less of this kind of assuming power roles, less of this gulf between different sides, and instead sort of greater equality between human beings. And hopefully this would lead to sort of greater room for recovery. And just thinking about what Merleau-Ponty said about babies, actually the old asylums used to be called the stone mother, so this sort of sense of containment of the asylum, for a sort of distressed child, if you like, and I guess we can all relate to that. So would it therefore not make sense, in a way, in psychiatric hospitals today to provide more opportunity for this embodied response to crisis, much like, a baby has? So what I want is to sort of have these practices dance movement and meditation integrated as a routine part of everyday care on acute general inpatient units. So I'm not really talking about specialized units because they operate quite differently. And it's not new. Obviously, dance has been practiced for millennia, you know, and I grew up in Africa, and it's kind of used in every which way as celebration, death, everything really. And dance movement psychotherapy has been around a long time. There's a lot of evidence from this work. But what's potentially quite new here, and particularly from my experience, is that actually having these practices carried out by staff and patients together. And I think that's what I would like to see happen. And though it's a kind of simple idea, I think it's not really done very much. And someone talked about sort of no man's land, this liminal space. And I often think of psychiatric wards as this sort of psychological no man's land, where people are caught in this liminal space of kind of not in movement, but not in stillness. And I think that if we could sort of come out of this thinking, this chaos, and into these two poles of either movement through dance or stillness, where there really is this sort of opportunity to reflect and go inwards, then I think that we might give people a bit more of a chance at recovery. So, as I said, I want staff and patients to practice these two things together daily, almost like a ritual. And I really do think that that will break down some barriers and also sort of just create a much nicer environment in which potentially there might be less restraints on wards, less need for sort of high-dose medication, and a more general dynamic approach to healing whilst a person is an inpatient on a ward. And I've seen it work. You know, you see in an exercise session on a psychiatric intensive care unit, probably the most violent place in psychiatric sort of services, and you have 10 women doing an exercise class, and there's never any aggression or violence. There's just people connecting with each other and this kind of very normal behavior. And actually last week I heard from a lady who described her first hospital admission. She had a very serious psychotic crisis. And one of the things she mentioned as being good on the ward was this dance group. And why? Because she said everything else was really frightening. And suddenly we were all the same. We were all just letting our baggage out and letting go of it and having a good laugh, and we were all in it together. So I think we can provide some kind of shared common space, which I don't think is always so easily provided on wards, and I think we need to work at that. So we're not only our minds, we're also our bodies. We are our mind bodies, and I'm really keen to know what would happen if we stopped just concentrating on sort of symptoms, on pathology and language, but actually allow for this more embodied response to mental illness and crisis, really. Thanks.